Hi, everyone. Thanks for all settling in to this very full room. It's great to see you all here tonight. Good evening and welcome to Kunstinstituut Melly. My name is Vivian Zahul. Many of you know me. I'm the Research and Programs Manager here. And it's very humbling to be introducing this exceptional program, which is co-presented with the Education and Research Initiative, Blacker Blackness. I think I speak on behalf of the team, we're very appreciative of being able to host Professor Denise Ferreira de Silva with us, who is currently the Samuel Rudin Professor in the Humanities at NYU, as well as the artists Ola Hassanain and Jota Mombaça. And tonight we'll be able to have the opportunity to join with them in some threads of their very urgent and long-standing conversations with each other. To offer some framing, tonight's keynote and conversation concerns notions of ancestry and inheritance in the context of our current thematic exhibition, My Oma, or My Grandmother, that opened here last December. It marked the conclusion of the tenure of our former director, Sophia Hernandez-Chong-Hui. We're very excited to have our current director coming in and opening a program soon, Gabin Kobo. And that exhibition, My Oma, was curated by a team that included also my colleagues Rosa de Graaf, Jessie Koyman, and Julia Mochkute. As such, tonight's program concerns time and considers of inheritance also questions of how time is summoned, held and fashioned into forms of temporal entrapment, what Ola Hassanain has spoken of as a tyranny of waiting. Time is very apt in introducing this program because it took us a few attempts to find the right time for this program. And I'd like to thank audiences here tonight who booked for previously planned editions of the keynote, as well as those who signed up for a previously convened masterclass. And above all, the flexibility and support of the Melly team, as we've arrived here in what is surely the right moment to have this conversation. The running order for our evening opens with a keynote by Professor Denise Ferreira de Silva that returns to her 2022 publication, simply titled Unpayable Debt. The book sharpens and gives a systematic structure to the critical toolbox that Denise has been forging since the publication of her previous monograph, Towards a Global Idea of Race, that was released in 2007. That book enacted a rigorous exhaustion of the corpus of liberal thought, particularly in its onto-epistemological frameworks of space and time, relative to effects such as linearity, interiority, causality, justice, rights, etc. And we welcome these remarks all the more tonight, as the conditions and mechanisms of justice globally are being exposed in their utter failure. And I would also like to acknowledge the devastating circumstances of displacement and genocide at present in many parts of the world, and to again say and extend a thanks for coming out tonight and for being here amid so many urgencies. Following Denise's keynote, she will be joined by two respondents, both of whom we are delighted to be hosting as artists of the exhibition My Oma. Ola Hassanain and Jota Mombaça, as I've mentioned. And among all three of our guests tonight, there's a very strong motif of these interlaced categories of debt, inheritance, and ancestry as they adhere in the figure of the dwelling or of the family home. For Denise, this figures in Octavia Butler's protagonist, Dana, who finds that her arm has become lodged within a plaster wall as she is flung between her 1976 present and the antebellum South of her slave-owning ancestor. And that figures in chapter 4 of Unpayable Debt, titled Where Flesh Joined in Plaster. For Ola, this spectral presence is figured in the cracks that have claimed her grandmother's house in the Jazeera region of Sudan, which has been rendered uninhabitable by the emptying of water tables caused by colonial agricultural schemes. And I really encourage you to go and see Ola's exhibition currently on at the Bureau Stedelijk, opened just this week, and that continues exactly those questions into a very beautifully fleshed out installation. For Jota, whose work is on exhibition upstairs through until the 1st of September, the dwelling returns in the rubble of renovations that were a constant of her childhood. Her installation invokes an idea of absence vessels as another form of dwelling, a housing for absence as a horizon of foreclosed possibility. So before handing over to Denise to lead off the program, I have two small notes. The first is that tonight's program is being video recorded, so if you don't wish to be part of a published video recording, please just approach myself or another staff member. And second, we welcome you to join us for refreshments downstairs in the cantina following the program, where copies of the book Unpayable Debt are available on sale. Just a couple of them. So, without any further ado, it is my, it's a very special moment to be able to invite Professor de Silva, Ferreira de Silva, to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Vivian, for this excellent introduction to our conversation, both the conversation the three of us will have, but also the one that hopefully will follow. And I'd like to thank Gabi for welcoming me in her new home, and also the amazing team at Melly that made it possible, including these glasses working right now. Thank you so much. Hopefully I'm not going to break them again. And thank you for coming, and I'm really glad that I'm finally able to be part of the program to which I was invited a couple of years ago now. Okay, let me just have my timer and read this thing. At first, every invitation to speak about the proposition that appears in the monograph titled Unpayable Debt, every invitation excited me so much that I forgot the nature of the task to which I was about to commit. I would say yes, and then when came the moment, just before I had to start the presentation, I would just remember how difficult it is to do, how impossible it is to produce a straightforward summary of the argument in the book, or even summarize how it is presented in the book. So after the third or fourth time, I found myself in this, situation. I realized that instead of giving a talk on unpayable debt, it made more sense to frame my talks as being about unpayable debt. So I've given 4 or 5 talks about unpayable debt. And maybe that's why, partly why this talk has a slightly different title. It's not about unpayable debt. It's not on unpayable debt. It's revisiting unpayable debt. But still, every occasion is a first. Each requires a decision about how to talk about something that can and could only be presented as writing or in writing. So for today, in the context of the exhibition My Oma, and in light of the conversations that will follow, and they will include, obviously, the response by Ola and Jota, these brilliant black lights who accepted to be part of that with me. Thank you. I decided to frame the presentation as 3 answers for one question. Why unpayable debt? So the first answer provides an account of the underlying, ongoing political conceptual proposition the book and its arguments allow me to advance. The second answer describes the immediate global historical moment, the political conjuncture that motivated the work. And the third answer reflects on a philosophical intervention the book performs, but is an intervention that it's not really foregrounded in the book, even though it does happen in it. Now, all three, in fact, touch on the general concern that has moved my thinking in the past 40 years or so. And yes, that long. And I can only describe this thing as a hopeless impulse to try and figure out the deeper structures that account for the shortcomings of my generation's attempts at rewriting the political text. And I'm using plural, yes, generations, because I started early. So I have been politically active for a long time, that I belong to the generation that addressed the political infrastructure and the devastations required by capital accumulation, and they did so defending classic anti-colonial, anti-imperialist Marxist agendas in the 1970s. I was a baby, I was in nursery, but it did happen. And then the one, actually, whose emergence in the 1980s redesigned the political field itself, with the articulation of political subject positions organized by the notions of race, gender, and sexuality. And then another one of the 1990s and 2000s, which advanced what I would call tamer liberal demands for the protection of human rights, as well as for diversity and inclusion. And those demands were, for the most part, advanced from within the liberal form of the NGO, of the non-governmental organization. So this preoccupation addresses each of these attempts, but now in this moment becomes all the more urgent now that the universities are apparently joining in the backlash against critical scholarship. Critical scholarship to the formation of which my generations contributed. And I'm saying, so I think it's apparently joining, and I'm saying apparently joining just because I want to give it the benefit of the doubt, because if it's true. But anyway, it causes me no happiness, but I have to say that Unpayable that responds precisely to the limitations of the critical agenda now also under attack. So the book's argument gives continuity to my mapping of the partial departures performed by us in the 1980s, as well as the critique of the sociological inclusion I do in Toward the Global Idea of Race. And then it extends that previous book's critique of the ethical principle of humanity that guided the human rights framework embraced in the 1990s and 2000s. But Unpayable that then performs its own time travel by returning to the 1970s through an engagement, in chapter 3, through an engagement with the method of presentation of the classical historical materialist critical text. Now, unlike Toward the Global Idea of Race, Unpayable that foregrounds colonial and racial subjugation in the interrogation of the post-Enlightenment version of the modern text. And it does so because, as the thousands of persons killed and displaced in Gaza, in the Congo, DRC, in Sudan, in Haiti, in Brazil, and elsewhere, as those killings and displacements testify, and also the reason why now another generation, my students, are once again rewriting the political text. These two moments testify that, and they do it once again, that racial and colonial violence continue to delimit the reach of the ethical program led by the principle of liberty and the juridic economic formation it protects. So let me introduce the first answer to the question of why Unpayable that with a quote from the Zapatistas. from the Second Declaration, June 1994. I quote, "Our struggle continues. The Zapatista flag still waves over the Mexican southeast, and today we say, we'll not surrender. Facing the mountain, we speak with our dead so that they will reveal to us in their word the path down which our veiled faces, to which our veiled faces should turn. The drums rang, and in the voice of the earth, our pain spoke, and our history spoke. For everyone, everything, say our dead. Until it is so, there will be nothing for us." I think I need to do something here. Let's see. Okay, maybe it's better. So key to Unpayable That is an ethical political statement that echoes this passage from the Zapatista Declaration from 1994, and that is decolonization, or the return of the total value expropriated from slave labor and extracted from native land under conditions of total violence. From this perspective, the political call for decolonization and the ethical demand for reparation are inseparable, but not indistinguishable. Decolonization would be then the political goal that has reparation as an irrealizable ethical mandate. The unfulfillable obligation to restore what would have been the common or ordinary way of any and each singular indigenous and Black persons and territories had colonial and racial subjugation and ecological devastation not taken place. Key to this properly global ethical program, something to which the argument in Unpayable That contributes, is to render this demand, the words of the Zapatista dead, to render it ethically and politically comprehensible. That is, it is to contribute for the assembling of analytical tools that expose the inseparability of capital accumulation and colonial racial subjugation, but also to the assembling of a speculative practice that invites and guides the imagination to contemplate existence without all that makes colonial and racial subjugation possible and necessary. So what's presented here is the thesis of irreparability as the basis for the demand for reparation. Saying it again, irreparability, which would then be the basis for decisions, design, and implementation of whatever is needed for addressing racial and colonial subjugation and ecological degradation, meaning, it's okay, I killed the phrase here, but anyway, I'll do something with it at the end. So the point, what is impossible here, right, is precisely to restore everything in a way that allows for the best possible existence for everyone and everything on this planet. So irreparability would lead to decisions as such, decisions that would allow for the best possible existence for everything and everyone on this planet. Urgency then, it will become comprehensible at some point. Urgency would then be the appropriate descriptor of decolonization as a political call that is nothing short of the immediate ceasing of extractive and expropriative operations and the immediate setting up of mechanisms for performing the impossible. That is, the return of all that has been taken and destroyed through the violent operations of state capital in the past 500 years or so. Another way of saying that, decolonization as a political goal acknowledges the impossibility of reparation as expressed by the future perfect, the impossibility of returning to what, how, something, someone, somewhere would have been now had colonial and racial subjugation not. So there is no rebuilding of what would have been, because there is no unhappening of what has happened. And this is key to the material process that gives us, the impression of passage of time, right? Can't unhappen. Things cannot unhappen. Or, entropy, they call it. So the force of the colonization as a political goal resides, I find, in the impossibility of fulfilling its ethical mandate. But it is precisely that impossibility, the impossibility of reparation, understood as a returning of all that has already become component of something else, or everything else. That impossibility should guide anything that is supposed to be comprehended by the phrase, by something called a global ethical program. And that program and its attempt would always fall short of its fulfillment, which means that it would also be the reason for furthering and continuing until it is the case that the only political goal is to strive towards this impossible fulfillment. So precisely is unsurmountably and inherently contradictory demand, the utter necessity of this impossibility, the return of everything, which I first found articulated in the second declaration of the Zapatistas, that guides two kinds of explorations in Unpayable That. On the one hand, it guides reflections and experimentations that take the shape of a critique of colonial and racial violence. And on the other hand, it guides speculations that address and reach beyond the existing metaphysical and onto epistemological infrastructure of thinking, those that render both colonial and racial violence an acceptable feature of capitalist existence. That is something that is part of the way of things, something that is met with indifference. Thinking and writing with Octavia E. Butler's character, Dana, in particular, have opened venues for engaging in both explorations beyond the epistemological and metaphysical limits of modern thought. Explorations that I now continue under the heading of interiority, which is a mapping of the infrastructures of thinking, and sensibility. But I'm not going to say much about it. But the film Soot Breath from 2019 has some things on sensibility, but basically it's the same intellectual pursuit. In any event, what follows then is as a presentation is part of the groundwork for the ethical proposition I have just introduced. But I will start with this, just giving you a little context of the book itself, which is then my second answer for the question, why Unpayable That? And that this context is the immediate global historical political conjuncture that led to, coming up with the phrase. But before I do that, I need water. So the phrase Unpayable That registered the historical moment between two of my generations, that of 1970s and the one from the 1980s. So I'm thinking about the very beginning of the 1980s when in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America, we were taking the streets to protest the government economic measures which were put in place in order to meet the demands from the International Monetary Fund. So the structural adjustment policies which were supposed to reform Brazil's economy in such a way that the country would be able to pay the foreign debt, not even the foreign debt, the interest, the service of the debt. So every day, it felt like, it wasn't really every day, but really felt like it would take the streets shouting two phrases. One, in Brazil, down with the military dictatorship, and the second one was this debt is unpayable. So the phrase returned to me back in 2007, 2008, during the so-called crisis of the subprime, which was blamed mostly on Latinx and African-American persons and families who were facing foreclosure because they were unable to pay for the variable rate bank loans they were encouraged or invited to take in order to buy their houses. So it was in my mind then 2 or 3 years later when Paula Chakravarty and I had our proposal, a proposal accepted by American Quarterly. And the proposal was for a special issue on the crisis of the subprime. So that was in 2010, 2011. So 3 years, after the crisis had started, then I used the general idea and the phrase itself in the first draft for the introduction to the special issue. And that was a special moment. Back then, Paula was living in the US, and I was living in London, in the UK. And I was teaching at a business school, but that's another story. And it was during James Cameron government, so 2010, 2011. And in that moment, Cameron was starting his social spending cuts. And the students, the high school students, the college students, our PhD students were out in the streets protesting the cuts in social spending. And back then, also learning how to avoid finding themselves when Kathleen was taking place. So we learned lots of things back then. So between, going to the demonstrations and then going back home, having escaped Kathleen, I wasn't ever I never found myself in one of those. I would write about I was working on these. What was the first version of the introduction, and the draft kind of, in a way, figured that moment because it was a mixture of storytelling, critical analysis, critical historical materialism, some philosophical speculations, and obviously already introduced by Dana, Octavia E. Butler's character, and it was introduced by Dana precisely because of the place of the home and the house, right? So Dana and her partner buy a home, and she's whisked back in time to slavery, and those Black and Latinx people were buying homes, and all of a sudden their lack of equity is the name of the thing they call it financially, just proved it impossible for that to happen. But that draft wasn't meant to be published. What I wrote was the process of thinking through that particular mode of exacting profit from those who had nothing, and then blaming them for the devastation caused by those who engaged in that kind of profit-making. Because I don't know if you remember, so the crisis, so folks could not pay for the rates, but what caused the crisis is that these loans were mixed in these, I keep forgetting the name now, these financial instruments, which then when folks could not pay the loans, the financial instruments just exploded, and the whole global economy exploded with them. So to me, what was occupying my imagination is how can you possibly blame those who have nothing for something that was done by the others who have, a lot, everything. But anyway, the ideas, while the writing didn't make it into the introduction, and of course the philosophical speculations also did not, the ideas, they did make it into that introduction, and so did the phrase unpayable debt. But I would only write something under that title actually 5 years after the publication of the special issue in 2017. And that was a talk that I gave in Athens as part of the Apartheid Society. And the Apartheid Society was one of the public programs leading to Documenta 14. As you remember, was castle in Athens, and the folks in Germany were trying to make up for some meanness from Merkel, to say it lightly. But anyway, I was invited to speak, and I was invited because of that work on the crisis, and the folks in Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland were here being blamed, for they use troubles to come, whatever. And I was like telling myself, I have lived under similar situation. I'm not going to Greece, tell people in Greece how to deal with this situation, so what do I do? So I took my little piece on slavery and Dana and presented it. And yeah, that worked. Because the return was, we had we just reached that moment in which somebody, after a minute of silence, somebody's like, but it's just like here. I said, yeah. So, and then the conversation started. And then I published that talk as an essay, Unpayable That. And that essay became the book. So the book is just an expanded version of that essay. It has the same key ideas and the same structure as the essay. So in that essay, then I gathered all the pieces which then were expanded into the book, Unpayable That, which was published another 5 years later. In it, Octavia Butler's kindred, Dana's predicament, guides the argument regarding how those who were worst affected by the remedies for the 2007-2008 global economic crisis were precisely the ones who had lost the most. They were also, of course, those who had been for centuries now the primary target of the colonial and racial apparatus that support the extractive machinery of capital. I think I don't want to say much more about this. Yeah. So I'm just going to say that yeah, I'm not going to summarize it. Let me just move to the third part of this, to reflect on the philosophical intervention that the book performs. Because if I start, every time I try to say any little thing about, I end up adding another 10 minutes trying to explain and explain. So you don't. But it's better if we do it during the Q&A, because then it's not. But seriously, I prefer to do it during the Q&A, because if not, I just feel like, oh, I can't stand this book anymore. Take it out of me. So the third answer for why Unpayable That, is the general philosophical intervention the book performs. And I'm calling it philosophical intervention really because I don't have any other name for it. Eventually, I think I'll figure out what to call, because philosophical intervention is like, it's, is it a thing? I don't think so, but it is a name I have for now. But anyway, so what Denise travels in space-time have inspired me to consider, and it is that which accounts for the bulk of Unpayable That, the book, is how the body supports the ethical political role that the transparent I, what I call the thing of interiority, has performed in modern think. The body supports the ethical political role that the transparent I has performed in modern representation. And it does so because turning to blackness in the register of colonial subjugation and doing so through Dana's predicament offers something to thinking, but something that it offers via the imagination. And that is, to me, a way of locating onto epistemologically, so a way of locating subjectivity which then makes it available for considerations of the work it has been doing as an element of the post-Enlightenment political architecture. Okay, so doing this is not something new that I have discovered. The fact that Blackness allows for this to be done is something that Horton Spiller, Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, Lyndon Barrett, and others have taught us already, and that has to do with the absence of the presumption of a direct, unmediated access to the enslaved person subjectivities. And of those, I think Saidiya Hartman and Horton Spiller provide us the best account of that. But something that I, along with others, have added to that is the acknowledgement that after slavery, a black subjectivity could be articulated, but only through the treatment given by social scientific tools. So, and here, I'm referring, among those tools, the one I talk about the most is the category of Blackness. But through social scientific tools, what we find is that subjectivity is articulated not in like the one that it's obtained by the Kantian subjective universality, the subjectivity connected to the reflective judgment. Not that one, but as a subjectivity that is a product of the determinative tools of reason. So a particular subjectivity, that of a specific type of the human, right, of a race or a variety of the human genus. So this is not the general universal one, the Kantian one, the subjective, captured in this phrase, which is also an oxymoron, subjective universality, or the Hegelian presentation of subjectivity. So it becomes, there is something else then that becomes available for thinking through with Dana. So here, it is about that unavailable enslaved subjectivity, but it's not about the one that is given to us by the determinative tools, right? Something else that becomes available, but only when we encounter her body in the scene of total violence. So Dana's body beaten under the threat of rape and death. So in that scene, her body is not yet apprehended by the concept of the racial or the cultural, or by the category of Blackness. So in that scene, the wounded body, the one not yet, but which would be eventually comprehended by the tools of knowledge, that wounded body in the scene, that wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation, that body allows us to consider the body without the ways through which it has figured in modern philosophy. And I'm speaking it slowly because, okay, so and those ways there are two ways, and each of them with the two little ways, I should have a little PowerPoint. Now I see why I needed one. That's the only moment that this text needs one, because it is an image, right? I want you to have an image in mind. It's not about what I'm saying so much as how it would look like. But I'm talking about here, on the one hand, the actual body, so my actual body, which is, on the one hand, the body that, I can touch, and that you see, the phenomenal body, but it is also an empirical body. It's a body that can be studied. Somebody can come here and describe how my body is doing the work here while I speak. So it's a phenomenon in the empirical body. It's the actual in the sense, when I say actual, I mean something that is in space-time. And then the formal body, and that formal body is also split into two. You have the categorical body, which is, the body apprehended by the categories, but it's also the one that is introduced in the Cartesian inaugural statement, and then the historical body, the body which here I'm using the historical body to name the body as described by Foucault and Butler and others, even though I know that their formal apprehension of the body is not historical, but I will still call it historical, because the body connected to some ideas of culture, ideology. So that is a way in which I can get away with calling it historical, even though, there is lots of work to make the case, but it is that, that Foucauldian body as a site of inscription of the productive and violent tools of modern knowledge power. So and that is more, obviously. But anyway, the inaugural apprehension of the body as substance, res tensa, obviously goes back to the Cartesian inaugural statement that renders the body of man subjected to the thinking thing, as a tool, but not as a determinant moment in knowledge. And since then, the body has been constructed as playing a double role in regards to knowing. As I was saying, as the particular human body, it was reduced to the senses, the phenomenal body. And that is the body as the passive cognitive mechanism through which the human apprehends everything else that exists. And the human in this is the effective and productive force. And also the body as a formal thing. The formal body is, on the one hand, the general image for things, both as that which has extension and solidity, but also as that which captures a moving mechanism or organism, or also inert matter. So this second image of the body, this is a body, right? No matter I try to do this, my pen will not go through this thing. This is the idea of the body having solidity and extension. And this is the body that gives us the notion of space, by the way. As we know, the formal body has played the most important role in modern knowledge, both in historic and scientific representation. And it has so because of how it constitutes the basic image, anyway, as I was saying, for any object of investigation or interpretation. But in particular, objects of investigation which are expected to share in its attributes, such as, for instance, unity. And here is, you think in terms of solidity, this is one thing, this is one phone. It's my phone with this old thing, right? This. Now, the phenomenal body, it then functions as the presupposed instrument of knowledge. So, but although the empirical body, the ones that can be studied, had already figured in Newton's 18th century natural philosophy, only in the 19th century, the internal motions of the empirical body would come into scientific scrutiny. And so it is this empirical body that gives us both the concept of the ratio, right? But then also the laws of gravitation. So that's the one that gives us what is apprehended by the term universal. And I say that knowing that can bring up questions. But anyway, so thinking with then as enslaved black female body, these renderings of the body lose their almost necessary hold of our imagination. Because these are not the immediate image that comes to mind when one tries images. Those are not the immediate images that come to mind when one tries to understand how is it possible that her body could have dislocated, moved in space-time. So on the one hand, that Dana could immediately find herself back then in Maryland in the 19th century. That violates the basics of Newton's empirical body, dislocation, external motion, because that happens in space with time. On the other hand, that her body could exist in 1836 and in 1976 in her home in Los Angeles and the Wheeling Farm raised questions about whether it was or could be the same body that continued to exist in 1976 and 1836. So the point here is that while the trips in time did not last long from the Los Angeles present moment perspective, there were time intervals in that present, in Los Angeles present, during which Dana was absent from her house without having physically left it. Yet, when she her actual body returned, she carried the marks, like, for instance, when she was beaten, she carried the marks of having been elsewhere all the same. In her, and you can think that it's in her empirical body and her phenomenal body, because she was beaten and it hurt, right? So when exploring these violations in Unpayable That, I follow them to two sets of explorations. On the one hand, I explored how these basic breaches of separability, and also, they also consequently disrupt sequentiality and determinacy. On the other hand, I explored the questioning of identity and unity. So could it be the one and the same actual body in 1836 and 1976? And explored it by speculating on the possibility that Dana's body had always been simultaneously in both places and times. That is, that in each location what was there was an instance of it as a singular redecomposition of what has always existed. That is, Dana's body, it could be the case, was in both heres and nows at the same time, or it did not travel, it didn't move at all. But, okay, so I'm going to read the relevant passage from Kindred in regard to these violations, and then I'll move to, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. Quote, I could feel the knife in my hand, still slippery with perspiration. A slave was a slave. Anything could be done to her, and Rufus was Rufus, erratic, alternately generous and vicious. I could accept him as my ancestor, my younger brother, my friend, but not as my master, not as my lover. He had understood that was. I twisted sharply, broke away from him. He caught me, trying not to hurt me. I was aware of him trying not to hurt me, even as I raised the knife, even as I sank it into his side. He screamed. I had never heard anyone screaming that way, an animal sound. He screamed again, a lower, ugly gurgle. He lost his hold on my hand for a moment, but caught my arm before I could get away. I pulled the knife free of him somehow, raised it, and brought it down again into his back. This time he only grunted. He collapsed across me, somehow still alive, still holding my arm. I was back home in my house, in my own time, but I was still caught somehow, joined to the wall, as though my arm were growing out of it or growing into it. From the elbow to the end of the fingers, my left arm had become a part of the wall. I looked at the spot where flesh joined with plaster, stared at it uncomprehending. It was the exact spot Rufus' fingers had grasped. I pulled my arm toward me, pulled hard, and suddenly there was an avalanche of pain, red, impossible agony, and I screamed and screamed. That image of the arm stuck in the wall, that image invites us to consider that moment in space-time, Dana's house wall, without temporality and spatiality. That is, it allows us to think about and peer on what would be thinking without the epistemological pillars of modern thinking, separability, determinacy, and sequentiality, as well as its descriptors. What becomes of thinking when these pillars of modern thinking lose their grip over the imagination? So in regard to separability, which is given by both the empirical and the formal rendering of the body, but which is more crucially the core of the Cartesian inaugural articulation of knowing with certainty, in regards to it, it is almost impossible not to appreciate how the presumed unity given by history or culture that is captured by the notion of identity, for instance, is nothing other than a first philosophical and later a social scientific construction, which now governs the destiny of millions who have been displaced by the ravages that are sine qua non for capital accumulation. So identity is operative in determinative tools such as the social categories, race, gender, and sexuality, as well as the interpretive ones, such as the concept of culture and the nation. That same notion of identity in reference to bodies, that's something that is identical to itself and has an extension, and solidity is a separate thing, that one orients our presupposition about the locality of physical events, for instance, in accounts of cause and effect. And it operates also in historical arguments, for instance, the ones that are made against reparations that include the simple one, I didn't slave anyone, why should I pay for enslavement? But anyway, so let me close with a brief comment on how this departures is connected to the political, ethical, and philosophical proposition that I began. I mean, not the philosophical, the conceptual and political. So I have to, remind us again that the thinking guided by the formal and empirical renderings of the body, the image that holds everything that exists in space-time, that thinking replays over and over again the Cartesian inaugural distinction. And for that reason, not so much consideration is given, and here I'm thinking particularly in the critical field of intervention, and in particular the interventions that address the colonial, racial, heteropatriarchal matrix. Not much of consideration is given to that which sustains both terms of the Cartesian distinction, mind and body, and that is linearity. It is linearity that obtains the transparent eye, for instance, as continuity in time, the straight line. But is in regards to the body, linearity is also given by the surrounding line, as this body delimits in space, rectangle, right? Could be a circle too. So both renderings of linearity as space and as time. Oh, okay. Didn't like it that much, did it? Okay. Both are I'm okay. Both are violated in that moment. Both are violated in that moment. The thing of interiority, the transparent eye, and the body, both are violated in that moment where Dennis' flesh meets the plaster, where her flesh and the plaster are indistinguishable. Because that exact point where her arm appears glued to as part of the wall, from that point, then there, because it's always a moment, it's always actual, right? It's always space-time. I find that it is possible to reconsider existence. That is that which is plotted every time, by addressing that which is plotted every time we speak or think of things that exist. So that reconsideration can take place metaphysically. So Dennis' body allows us to present existence in terms of figurality rather than unity and identity, and existentially, too, in terms of implicancy rather than informal or or causal efficacy. But it also allows us to think of the body in terms of singularity rather than using quantity reference like the one and the many, etc. So in terms of knowing, it does so because in terms of knowing, it collapses the analytical and the syntactical modalities of knowledge, and invites, the imagination to consider knowing without determination, interpretation, or any way of assigning efficacy to terms or conditions because of the inseparability between, for instance, my hand and the telephone. So what's invited here is something that, I can only call reading. A reading that it's complex, a fractal composition that takes all the different many aspects into account. So at each moment we're reading a given configuration of existence and event. And in this reading, which takes the same form as the composition that one is attempting to describe, that reading is a kind of knowing that in that very moment, as a knowing, it would be redecomposed into something else while being composed of that which renders in the composition of everything. So that which is read and the reading itself share in the same. There is no separation even in that moment. But I think I just want to say, close by, just considering suggesting what becomes imaginable and thinkable through such departures from the modern pillars and infrastructures into that which, Dana's body invites. I think the design of it's become possible to imagine and to think of a critical approach to global capital, to a plan for dismantling its neoliberal political architecture that is guided by decolonization, as described at the beginning of this talk. And decolonization as the activation of irreparability, as the force moving the necessary striving for completing the impossible task, namely the return of the total value extracted and expropriated from native lands and slave labor, that which had entered in the composition of everything that exists right here, right now. And that is just another version of the words of the Zapatista dad, I think. For everyone, everything, say or dad, until it is so, there will be nothing for us. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Now we're moving to the responses, and I was left with the task of offering the first response, which is very challenging. I want to thank everyone who made this encounter possible. It's really a pleasure to be here with two friends that I miss a lot. I'll be brief. We'll try to be brief with the responses so the word can circulate and it can return to you for Q&A really soon. Of course, there are many things happening in my body right now after listening to Denise's very generous presentation. But I've been, while listening to it, I'm an Octavia Butler nerd. So the whole thesis of like Dana time travel not being like a travel, or Dana not, the idea of Dana not going anywhere is one that really excites me. as an Octavia Butler nerd. Because, of course, it points out to the way how Dana's predicament is, in a way, a violent attunement to this multidimensionality of the Black experience and of one experience. And I'm quite interested in this idea of time travel as attunement rather than, which I think maybe I'm fantasizing, but maybe Octavia Butler would love that idea, because one of the things around kindred is precisely the way Octavia Butler refuses to spend a lot of time thinking about time travel or describing how do time travel works, which was like a topic, a big topic in the sci-fi community. Actually, there's something about this time travel as a form of attunement to the multi-dimensionality of experience that I think Octavia Butler would be quite interested about. And I think it's really interesting because that makes me think about an idea that comes and goes in Denise's work. This figuration of the body, of the sensorial body, or of like the sensorial manifestation of the body, which I would like, and I like to think, as a body that is, in a way, or that practices a form of attunement to re-decompositional dimension of experience. And that makes me think, of course, about the political task and about the ethical political proposition. Because if we think with this concept of re-decomposition, which is one that I'm quite thankful for, as it has offered a lot of us who follow your work and who are practicing in the fields of art a very comprehensive tool, like to imagine what we are doing with these questions we are facing from our positional bodies, but also in relation to these times and the political challenges of these times. So I think that in a way the concept of redecomposition and the idea of the sensorial body as one that attunes to that dimension, to that praxis, to that movement, is one that allow us to engage with the impossible task of reparation as an acknowledgement of irreparability. Because, and of course, things cannot unhappen, but there's something in the tool of redecomposition that might allow for a dismantling of repetition, which is precisely one of the major tools of colonial power. And it's an imperial appropriation of time, that we are like thrown in this never-ending loop of the same gestures of total violence and of the same expropriation. So it's when Dana buys the house and then she's transported, and that makes me quite emotional because, of course, house is like a topic for many of us. So when Dana buys the house, she's then transported back into the plantation scene. So when the Latinx community and the Black communities buy houses, they are then transported back to the scene of debt, to the subprime crisis. And there's this thing, which, I mean, if there's another Octavia Butler nerd here, you can correct me at some point. But there's this very complicated thing around the way Octavia Butler herself died. Apparently, she was always quite intentional about the idea of buying a house. So in her archive, there's all these notes that are like really about manifesting the conditions to be able to afford a house. And then she died quite early in that house she afforded. And once I read somewhere the story, or maybe I've dreamed about it, and maybe this is like a total non-fact. So, but I mean, it might help us to think about something. Once I read that, Octavia was found dead at a certain point, but at the doorsteps of her house. And that thing kind of like messes with me. This idea of like you living for affording a house, and then you get that. And then you are found dead at the doorsteps of said house. And I think the doorstep here is like a particular architectural position that really makes me think about all that we talked. It makes me think about the concept of unpayable debt. So there is this repetition, which is a colonial tool. And then there is the re-decomposition, which is anti-colonial or decolonial or whatever. It is a tool that we have here, thanks to you and to your offerings. So I wanted to respond in that way, to think about from that moment, that violent attunement that is there in Dana's predicament with the multidimensionality of her experience, to the sensorial body as one that attunes to the redecompositional aspect of everything, and then back to the political task, which is the one of redecompose or attune to redecomposition as a way to dismantle colonial repetition, which we are like witnessing incessantly all the time. That is my response for now. I hope it can spark a conversation as well. I'll be around.
Thank you, Jota. And thank you, of course, Denise, for this amazing... Also, I always, whenever I listen to you talk also about unpayable debt, every time something new pops up to me, which I get super excited about. However, what I'm going to point out isn't the new thing that popped out to me, but it is this aspect of irreparability as the basis for the demand to live, right? And I think of it, of course, also in relation to the house, right? The enclosure, the house also as architecture of what to do with what we've built so far, right? And how to actually truly take a call for things being irreparable as a way to go, right? Or as even a spatial thinking. I, of course, still have my little attachments to space and time in different ways. So I'm maybe gonna be a little annoying with this, but there are, of course, moments where, especially the moment where Dana's arm becomes fused to the body of the building of the house, right? And at the time, at that moment that happened, the only way by which we know that there was a kind of severing that happened was her sensory response, right? Her screaming out in pain that her arm actually got detached from this structure. And I bring this up because of also prior to, let's say, the modern episteme of also thinking spatially is the fact that there were processes of formulating space, and I'm not saying that you're denying that or whatnot, but it's just to bring about that actually there was a figuration also in the process of building, and the spaces produced to inhabit, that they were to be an extension of the actual body. They were replications and recreations of the body, and and mostly actually in African architecture, they were female bodies. The living space was supposed to be very resembling the reproductive organ and so on and so forth. So there was a lot to sort of that comes up in a call for irreparability, and what that would translate into in terms of spatiality as well. I, of course, would love to let go of the whole discipline as like architecture as the whole discipline in the way it exists now, of course. But of course that because what it has done so far, what it has taken and what it has kind of built upon has created sort of a sedimentation of valuable things that are kind of at the bottom, that are kind of impossible to reach at this point, right? And I feel that if we were to continue creating space for and extract utilitarian value for it, it'll have to be extensions that come through this process of figuration, of course, as well. I also started to think about the aspect of waiting as well. I mean, the aspect of time, when also Dana, you'd mentioned that Dana hadn't moved at all because it was in different places at the same time. And I was wondering how decisions can be made when you're in a state of like no movement, right? Like no progress, which of course to me in my work I read it as this sort of imposed waiting, this suspension of time. Actually, there's nothing that can actually take place because of that political positionality. You only wait for that looming kind of violence to come upon you again, right? And what you mentioned about the doorstep, this architectural threshold, is of course a painful reminder of that this is coming back somehow, and it doesn't need us to go anywhere. Even if we sit still, it's coming, Sorry for the doom and gloom vibe, but but that's how it is. There's a lot more questions, but I'd like to maybe stop here for the response, just to give a moment for your reaction.
Thank you both for responding with so much brilliance. That makes the task enjoyable, but much more difficult, as I have to strive not to just take it up to the stratosphere. But so I will take it out there. Also because the questions, I think, obviously, expectedly, the questions on the comments, both comments from Jota and from Ola, you're going to the core of what I think is the intervention. I think Jota, one is a provocation, right? And I'm going to take the provocation and I'm going to send it back to you, and you're going to have to do some work with it. That has to do with attunement itself, right? Which is, I mean, it's kind of, we need, if so, then we need also an image of the sensorial body that would be fully in, in attuned to that, and not only some kind of mental or visual or auditive, right? So the question then, which I think goes back to the sensorial, it stays with, doesn't go anywhere, it stays with the sensorial body. But the way I approach it, so if we're not, if some kind of connection to what has happened can be, how do I say, can be activated immediately, instantaneously from where one's empirical body, phenomenal body is situated, then that, but without being only about thinking about it and connecting in that way, then I think, okay, two things. On the one hand, then we would need some account of the experience of, some phenomenology, which wouldn't be a phenomenology, but would be an account of the natural, I don't want to call it the natural attitude, but the natural, non-formal, an account of the non-formal existing thing in such a way that it would also take into account that which it doesn't really feel in a way. Because that connection would be given, because that connection is given by like quantum entanglement, whatever. So that connection is given by dark matter, for instance. You see, it was a sensorial body without sensation, because sensation takes you back to the mind. So you see, I'm trying to figure that situation in which we would not immediately restate the Cartesian in order to create that connection, assuming that it takes place. So that's why I was saying the phenomenal body. But we can have a formal presentation of the body, which is, I think, what I do. It's formal, not in not the Cartesian or Kantian sense, but it's really formal in the sense of being about, the material composite, the material presentation of a singular thing, in which is taken when we have that image, and it takes into account, and that image takes into account that fundamental connection, that fundamental in the quantic elemental sense, but it doesn't demand acknowledgement of it. It doesn't demand that body has an awareness of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, doesn't demand that. So that's what I'm more. So would we call it attunement? I don't know, because attunement brings me back. So the challenge is to you is like, yeah, maybe that is a mode of presenting or conceiving, imaging something that would come under the term attunement that does not bring back that division and awareness and consciousness. I think that's, as for, I think that your your final comment about how Octavia Butler died. The house she bought, because she got the MacArthur Genius Fellowship, right? So it was her work that gave her that, that money. That was acknowledgement of her genius, with which she bought the house. It's weird, isn't it? Because it's like it is as if that is this connection between representation, racial representation, and our conditions of existence functions like it's like witchcraft. It's modern witchcraft. Why? Because also of the ways in which all the many decisions we make in life are also mediated by this impossible future perfect. That which what has happened announces as that what must come to be, or else nothing makes sense. So to me, the challenge is, how do you interrupt the future perfect? How what we were supposed to become, at any moment, how what we are supposed to become does not realize itself in that moment, in that now. And for that, I think radio composition is, if we can stop that, and reconfigure, and we had a nice conversation about that today, probably, and reconfigure, like talking about the water signs in your grandmother's house, which were there, the watching, right? Which we watch for what is to happen without assuming that which was supposed to happen does not have to happen if you are watching. So anyway, so that is, but Ola, and then you come with the space. And the body itself. So I think in regards to maybe two things I was thinking about. On the one hand, the irreparability, operating in both ways. On the one hand, as a demand, as a demand and obligation onto the ones that have done the extraction and expropriation. They cannot make up for it. Right. Because for me, the irreparability is not in those who have been subjugated. Is another problem. It's not my problem. It's like, you can't repair the damage you have, whatever. Not my problem. So that I'm thinking from that perspective. But then if we think from how then also as an element of the decomposition, right? Because another part of a conversation we're having today had to do with how many of those things that we remember from the way people do it in the family and neighborhoods and territories, whatever, how many of those things account for the fact that colonial racial violence were not fully successful, right? So that is, even though, so that which has been a response to irreparability itself is still there as a response from the other side of it. So what that has to do with the relationship between bodies and space, and how we go about the actuality of our existence. I think that's the question. That's the question that our critical tools have to face all the time. Because as we can take into account, I think we should, in that sensorial body should take into account everything that cannot be felt. But then at the same time, it has. We cannot ignore our actual conditions, and that's the sociologist in me speaking, our actual conditions of existence, right? And we exist in space-time, and colonial and racial violence are inscribed also in space-time. So, but thank you for the provocations.
The re-provocation.
Okay. So we thank you. I mean, I think a round of applause is deserved, no? Yes. So we now open up for the floor entirely for questions, answers, responses. We have a lot of greatness in the room, which takes many forms: greatness of friendship, greatness of long-term conversations, many esteemed colleagues. So we hope that we might be able to get a conversation going in the time we have left. Looking for hands. Yes, we're going in the back.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It was a lovely experience listening to all of you. I also very much enjoyed the provocations brought to the table. I had a question for you, Denise. If you could perhaps elaborate on the specific position of capture that of the corporeal body that you lay out in Octavia Butler's work, and how I'm struggling to conceptualize how it would escape the capture in the modern episteme of racial violence. If you have a few words about that.
Yes, thank you for your question, right? Because from within the modern episteme, I find that it's absolutely impossible to escape the capture, but it's not impossible to design escape, not necessarily like escape, but more fugitive plans for create, and then in these fugitive plans, and I say fugitive because the image I have is the image of the slave escaping within the system of slavery, right? You don't get out of the system. So in that, and then from within, creating small, micro, maybe temporary conditions for maintaining what I'm just call here the best possible conditions for existing under such. So, and I think that's it, right? I think from that perspective, and I'm thinking from the political perspective, I think that's what we, given this explosion of fascism in all different guises, I guess everybody will have to figure out a way of surviving total violence. Existing, right, is a way of existing under total violence. This one on the political perspective, and that's the one that comes to me immediately, because I do want my students to figure things out, and I want to help them. So I'm thinking about it. But from the point of view of the imagination, right, because even as we know that we are existing within this context, it doesn't mean that at the level of the imagination we cannot begin also to devise different modes of existing and imaging existence that do not necessarily impose separability. And I think that's where I am, right? Hence these speculative moves, but also I'm very much interested in the critique of space-time. I cannot, all those generations of political action. You can't just pretend like, oh, it's all gone. It's not. It's constitutive of how I think. But I think that the task is double, and what's happening now in this particular moment, I think makes it. What's been happening forever. Right? But in this part, that's enough, right? It's time that we really push ourselves to, and not to try and repeat these other, practices. So in these two moments, right? I think politically we have to also create spaces within these, and it's not impossible. It's been done, and then at the same time, at the level of the imagination, we need to live differently. It's about doing it. It's not about projecting. It's about doing it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question in relation to temporality. I actually had a student once tell me, how can we stop being banished into temporalities? And no, but because we always, of course, talk also, of course, because this is the climate, this is the constant factor, the violence itself, and the let's say, looming catastrophes, that, how does a call for creating a certain fixity in this fair, what would a call for that?
Can you say more about the call for the fix?
So basically, for the whether it's the spaces for criticality to remain, to remain or become permanent, so to call for, I guess, the same things and the same characteristics, obviously, of the project we're in as well. You know, whether for example, with space, we're building for permanency, where everything is meant to last, and the continuity of this project, of course, is the fact that it's kind of cyclic, infinite, and continuous. So you want to stop it, or keep on? I want to keep what I want.
And let go of what you don't want.
Yeah.
Well, the question, how can we have it both ways?
You can't get rid of the bad in this situation, it seems.
The baby, the water, and the basin. Everything's got to go, I'm afraid.
I mean, why not? We perish together or flourish together.
I don't know. I think it's a question. I don't know anyone who has answers. To. I think it's a question. Really, I truly believe that this is something that we are going to do together, and the first step is to ask them the questions and consider them. So why should we have to to abandon all of it? I think we should, but I guess somebody can make a case for why not? Yeah, and then I'll be happy to listen to the case and don't know, maybe be convinced. I don't know, probably not, but I'll listen to the case. But I think the crucial is to ask the question instead of just repeating the answers, because now we're not even asking questions. We repeat the answers to what's happening. So the university goes all fascist. We want it to be more liberal. But it's like the two have always been together. It's not like if it goes back to being more liberal, it won't be intrinsically, fundamentally also fascistic. So we need something else then. Can that something else be the university? I don't know. As I said, I'm hoping, but I don't know.
Just like a brief comment. So, and continue what you said after our provocations. I think these things are also not to be thought through fundamentally, and I think I remember once, I think 5 years ago, I made a very similar question than the one you did to you. We were having like small talk at PAF, and I thought, like, how do you escape? And then you said something like this: every time I can, I try to live as if. And then when you say, which for me is a very beautiful formulation, I keep that close to my heart, and I tell that to everyone, because I think it's really, but I mean, to live as if already kind of entails a form of practice, or a way of moving, or a way of activating, that is not necessary. It's not that thinking is not a practice. I don't want to deny that, but there's something that needs to happen, not on the level of consciousness. And our political tools are too much dependent on consciousness, on the idea of consciousness, the idea that by becoming conscious, we can transform things, which is a fallacy. We've been like, we see how. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. And another thing, which is really fun, which is really kind of like dumb in a way, but I want to say, I think every time I think about escaping and impossibility, I think that's one of the most beautiful aspects of the flight and running away and escaping, is that the fact that it's impossible is one of its fundamental conditions. If a door is open, you just cross, you just get out. But if you escape, it's because that wasn't a formal possibility. So I think there's something about performing the impossible that is always already present in the praxis of escaping. So just wanted to say this thing.
I just thought about watching as that praxis, maybe, that can cultivate, like help teach us, in a sense. Like dedicate time for analysis and watching in the hopes of catching, you know, a certain detail that we've missed because we've completely sort of conditioned ourselves to look out for particular, you know, things, right? And I wanted to know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about it when you talk about watching and the circumstance of watching, because you know, in the case that you're describing, watching to see if the water is having an effect, there was a decision that was made at some point, at some moment, of which those watching did not take part, but those watching are taking part of what's happening in that now, in that place, and according to, you know, how they actually read the situation, they can make decisions. That is a limit to those decisions, of course, because, you know, at the end it's a big dam. But still, you can make decisions that will you know, bring the catastrophe that has already happened. When the first decision was made, it will stop that catastrophe from, right, in that moment. Or it will at least prevent it from affecting those who are there in that moment. It may not, it's not going to stop forever. So I mean, yeah, that sense of knowing what is going to happen or what has happened, so we have control over it. We have to let go of that because it's also an illusion. But you can read at each and every moment, you can read what's happening, and that, you know, I think that's part of us calling self-defense. No? Exactly. So those minor gestures of self-defense that you do in view of, you know, the future perfect, that the violence has been done anyway. Yeah. But, you know, you curb its, you know, its enormity by watching. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone has a question from the audience? No?
Hi, yeah. Thank you very much, all three, for your amazing presentations. I was just thinking very much this kind of image with Dana being stuck, her arm on the wall, and what you were saying. And I was kind of wondering whether this is also because, Denise, you spoke at some point at the beginning about the connection of racial and ecological violence. And I was very much thinking, like, to what an extent do you think that this kind of image is like a figuration of how the matterings of the past kind of continue playing out in the present? Because you talked a lot about separability, and I think that's a problem, that we have temporal separability, and it's something that happens with climate change framework that kind of talks about the future generations but not the past, and then it's kind of we don't really have any idea about what it is about, it feels sometimes. So I was very much thinking, I wanted to hear more about you, because I'm thinking very much in a more Baradian way, perhaps, of how, like, space-time mattering figures out that moment that it's like you cannot separate time, and it's like the violence of the past that plays out in the present. If you can maybe speak a little bit about that.
I don't have much more to add than that. I think it's the violence of the past. It's never of the past, right? It's a violence that is constitutive of everything that it is here now. So it's also not about repetition, right? Because not one thing, then that thing comes back. No, it's the thing. Violence is the house, right? And because violence is the house, her arm got stuck in it, in the ways in which, you know. So that's and here again, as you are mentioning, the separation between what's social and environmental is also, or ecological, is also part of the same separability. The assumption that, so on the one hand, you have the human rational blah blah, or cultural human, and how they go about life, and then on the other hand, that is their relation to what the surroundings. And then eventually at some point they will do something that will affect the surroundings, as if, you know, in the building, in the walking, you know, it's all absolutely fundamentally connected, both, you know, quantically, but also at the molecular level. We are the surroundings, right? If we could just live this way, right? Just like this, that's us too, which means not because it is us that we will take care of it, that's not the movement. That is us, which means that is inseparable from anything we do. Hence, now, after we have destroyed much of make the planet almost unlivable, but for the planet it's not really a problem, right? It's only for the living things on it. Then, you know, gotta do something to make it livable, at least keep it livable for some of the living things that need the planet. Because at the end of the day, the planet will follow its, you know, cosmic future, and eventually, I don't know what's going to happen. Something's going to happen. It will expand to, you know, fragment itself, or there will be a big bang again. I don't know what it is, but that's whatever. That's the planet. But anyway, that's its reality, its cosmic reality, which I think if we also took that into account, right? So time becomes these, how do I say? Because everything, no, I don't want to go there. No, okay, I'll stop. No. I got to stop answering questions that were not asked. I have this bad habit. Quiet.
Yes, thank you for all the insights. But I was wondering, also as a little bit of a Butler nerd, what about collectivity in this whole story? Because we're talking about the body nearly as a singular thing, but of course there's also the collective aspect to how we shape our world.
So I have maybe two ways of, again, answering, responding to the commentary, because I think that's an important commentary. I think that it is any of these shifts that, you know, that I'm imagining, that I think become imaginable and thinkable through that individual's body, that fictional individual's body. All those shifts are can only take place if they, you know, there is an agreement of sorts to engage in such shifts, right? It's not on the one hand. So that's one way of answering the question, because it's to the comment, which is an aspect that came to me. Now, on the other hand, when we have this, when we talk about collectives, that is always in there some presumption of a given unity that then says, you know, we are a collective given by these walls, by this room, right? That will separate us from the rest of the city or the country or the continent. So there is a presumption that that is something that brings us together as such, which is one of the infrastructures of thinking that must go. And then related to that, that is also the assumption that those who then are taken as members of part of that collective, they share something that makes them, you know, even if that something is to be part of that collective. So those two aspects of collectivity unity and identity, if they don't go away, if we don't eliminate them from our imagination, then I don't think the kind of shift that that needs to be made will be possible, right? Because those are actually basically the ones that account for so much of the violence, right? It's always there, right? So on the one hand, we need to do it together, and then on the other hand, the image of as a collective, if that becomes the framing one, then we have a problem. So that's why I take the body and then I pretend. I mean, I don't pretend. I identify those different ways in which it is plotted onto everything, right? Because that actually, even though that is what's being, I'm critiquing that, but it's still, that also gives us some sense, some way of talking about different things without separating them, but also at the same time without presenting them as a collective. So the fact that each one of us here has this actual formal, empirical, whatever body existence, right? That doesn't make us one. That doesn't make us a collective, but it is something, right, that we all, let's call it common. Though I don't want to get into the commons either, but but let's call it common for now. But yeah.
I'm not sure if we have one more question, or if maybe Jota and Ola, you'd like to make a final concluding reflection, because we're getting close to our end time. I'll leave it with you both.
I think for me, there's, the great kind of conversations we've been having, and looking at this sort of how-to, applicability of a lot of this theorization, with the role, combined with the role of watching, of also how to deal with, it makes me wonder about scale, the scale of also these acts of watching can take, and now think, listening to what you just said also about collectivity. I'm left kind of wondering, of course, about who to do this with, of course, and what the scale of that would be. And, of course, the where of that also. And this has been, of course, a big thing on my mind, at least now, with what has been happening in Sudan, of what to do, because what you want to do also is in many ways site-specific, and it needs you to be there, but this is the thing that kind of keeps you away all the time, and maybe throws you in spaces that are interesting, to say the least. But I think I'll just close with that. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, it's working. I don't know how to close, to be honest. But I'm just kind of like thinking about what we were just saying, but thinking about also the collectivity and how thinking about the body as a singularity is not the same as thinking about it as an individuality. I think this is an important philosophical distinction, because as a singularity, the body kind of contains collectivity of like bacteria and forces and forms and spirits and energies. And I think part of the call and the provocation Denise did when responding to it is also to break to a certain extent the way the collective calls for the social tools that modern coloniality has invented to organize our life together, like identity, unity, or even the idea of community, and which I don't want to deny, I just want to try to call to this imaginative exercise the provocations here invite us to do, which is how to imagine a collectivity that do not require that. And that also makes me think about these questions of scale, which I've really and definitely complicated, because modern coloniality built this like global massive issue, this massive tool of destruction. And every time we need to think about doing something in relation to that, we try to achieve that very same scale. And that's, I think, very limiting, to say the least.
Yeah, but we could also think that there is no one or even one group that will do everything, and then that our, in a way, part of our responsibility, a big part of it, is to facilitate and help and make sure that those who are doing the work in all of those, territories have support, because folks are doing the work, right, in different ways, different levels of the work. So you collaborate, and call on others to collaborate materially and immaterially, which is, I think, what that's, thinking about that, my answer to the other question about fugitivity. That's the call. We are all creating those spaces for breathing everywhere. So we got to make sure that we create the networks to make sure, like water networks, right? That is, and then it's not a responsibility of one because, they are a member of that community or that collective. It is because of irreparability. It's our obligation, right? But yeah, I mean, this is a difficult one, right? Because we have so much, our actions are so much comprehended by some understanding of a one, or of some kind of identity, whether it's, through whether biological or historical, that we cannot imagine that we would be involved, actively involved in the work that's done, the self-defense work done somewhere, if we don't have anything to do with them, right? So,
and without knowing.
Yeah.
So to be part of that, so even without knowing, even without apprehending.
Making sure it gets there.
So I think it's like about also suspend the ambition to apprehend the entirety, the scale, but to practice knowing that things correlate and affect each other.
Yeah, it's about transmitting more than capturing these things. So, because we're also stuck in notions that are more struggles that are more reactionary, I feel, to, state impositions and so on and so forth. So they are really not much of longer strategies, right? It's more about what you give to the others also, these transmissions, rather than the capturing. Yeah, there's a lot to do.
No, my generations, we tried. I mean, seriously, it's time to try something else. We keep trying the same things with the same tools.
Okay. So
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
On the note of collaboration, I need to thank Alexis Medina, Liza Walters, Joran Lavin, Lynn Kramer, Moran Hems, and Lou Lou Sainsbury as well. Claps and appreciation. And please be welcome downstairs. Thanks.